Today we're going to be talking about perfectionism and the roles of humility and surrender on the path of awakening, whatever our practice or our faith might be. In this post-self-help age, 40 years after the consciousness movement really got going in the West, this battle cry to perfect ourselves and to live our best life, to continuously nip and tuck our egos, has become both a blessing and a curse. While the injunction to live more enlightened lives is a positive force in our culture, of course, it can also become a constant reminder of everything in us that is missing, everything that remains to be polished or perfected. This struggle to make ourselves better physically, emotionally, and spiritually, to work at self-improvement, is intensified by a greedy consumerism which feeds off this very induced lack of self-esteem. We're led to believe that just up around the bend, just after the next retreat or initiation or chakra cleansing or spine aligning or divine transmission of whatever kind, we're going to attain a more perfect version of ourselves, a version of us that's better, that's purified and has no shadow or ignorance. We measure ourselves against this oversized idol of self and scrub away at our imperfections, waiting for a sudden hit of permanent divine awakening that's going to change us forever after. Of course, this never happens. Even when dramatic enlightenment experiences happen, incorporate gradually into our lives with moments of insight that are followed by darkness. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I'm thinking of a couple of living masters, Eckhart Tolle and Byron Katie, both of whom had sudden spiritual awakenings that were quite catastrophic in terms of breaking their egos open. But even for them, it took years to understand what had happened to them and to integrate enlightenment into their everyday lives and teachings. The same thing goes for every one of us. Even though major spiritual breakthroughs are absolutely possible, they're never complete and they're never perfect, for the simple reason that we are human beings, impermanent, contradictory creatures housed inside unpredictable bodies. We are a species that's divined by contradiction, that works against internal opposition. You could say that each of us is like a house divided between sensual, earthly reality and the life of the spirit. We're drawn out of our physical state by transcendent longing. From our carnal position, we get glimpses of divinity. We get intimations of immortality, as Wordsworth put it. But these experiences are always fleeting. This is how Wordsworth himself described it a couple of hundred years ago. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoever I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen I now can see no more. Now, even though Wordsworth is using this loss of childhood innocence to describe the seeming fall from grace, he may as well have been describing any seeker's experience, where moments of clarity, union, peace, divine awareness always pass and take their magic with them. Most of us know what it's like to be transported or lifted up by spirit momentarily, taken up out of the ordinary moment by an upswell of love or equanimity, and then dropped back into the fray of things where our flaws and our limitations are obvious, and that godly sense that we had just for a second just can't be found. These falls, so to speak, can feel like losses or failures and leave us frustrated by our incapacity to hold on to these blessed experiences. But it's only the ego that believes this false story, that mistakes change for personal failing. The soul knows that nothing is lost, that just as sunlight isn't extinguished when the star goes behind the clouds, neither does the connection to God, our indivisible link to divinity, dissolve when some experience or other passes. The ego imagines a permanent fall when it loses sight of eternity. It sees itself lost in a flawed universe, a kind of broken, unredeemed individual, alone in the cosmos, and waiting for some kind of supernatural healing or salvation to rekindle our light. But this is nothing but an illusion and a way to judge ourselves as unworthy. In fact, spiritual self-scorn and self-pity, which is what we're talking about, are byproducts of faith traditions that place God or Buddha mind or divine consciousness, whatever you want to call it, somewhere beyond our reach, outside our parameters as human beings. But this is an essential falsehood, and it's a falsehood that feeds this unquenchable thirst for perfection. The lie is the belief in our own separateness, the notion that the hidden sun is lost to us, this idea that there's something wrong with the natural fluctuations of consciousness. Like every other part of nature, consciousness remains in a state of flux, of expansion and contraction, of appearance and disappearance, inhalation and breathing out. In fact, the ego's fixed idea of perfection is a kind of death. It's a kind of freezing of complexity, human complexity, into a cartoon image of what an enlightened person looks like. As most of you know who've spent any time at all in spiritual circles, there's nothing sadder or more ridiculous than the sight of an insecure practitioner pretending to be perfect or better than he or she is. In fact, most of the time it's pretty sad. Let me give you an example. When I first started spending time in Germany with my teacher, Mother Mira, there was a guy in her community who exemplified this kind of fake perfectionism. Night after night during meditation, when Mother Mira blesses each visitor one by one, this guy would sit contorted and miserable looking on his cushions, kind of twisted into an unnatural lotus position, with his back ramrod straight and his eyes sort of half closed, smiling in this creepy way, as if he were trying to look enlightened, trying to impress Mother Mira with his rectitude and his discipline. He wore these flowing clothes and dozens of malas around his arms. Some of the German devotees had an unkind name for him, which translated into English as toilet brush, in reference to this stiffness in him. Toilet brush became our cautionary tale of spiritual perfectionism gone awry. It was clear that he'd been deeply affected by reading the lives of the saints, for example, especially the self-mortifying ascetic saints. He seemed to worship a kind of bloodless, disincarnated rapture that did nothing but leave him looking lost and desperate inside his own skin. We felt sorry for Toilet Brush because his pain and his strain were so palpable to everyone but himself. He was a walking example of what happens to any of us when we import ego, spiritual ego, onto the path and try to exclude the messy, irrational, fallible parts of what it means to be a human being. And this really is the crux of the matter, the crux. The truth of human messiness and being subject to the failings of the body is exactly what drives perfectionism for many in spiritual life. Existence in a body is always messy, and it always leads to death, which is how our yearning for transcendence was born. Seekers since the dawn of time have been asking ourselves, what doesn't die? What is eternal? What isn't subject to the degradations of the flesh? Not wanting to die and needing to find a way to live with our own impermanence, we invented the idea of deathlessness and the fantasy of not being completely human, even though we are flesh and blood. Religions, of course, exploit this fear of mortality by promising rebirth in heaven, a sanctified realm where we're washed clean and the threat of death can no longer touch us, provided, of course, that we behave and we do what we're told. The terror of extinction is what drove the earliest seekers to investigate their bodies and minds and seek freedom in a level of awareness beyond identity, a level of awareness where the personal form no longer mattered. This achievement, you have to call it an achievement, enabled liberated sages since the time of the Vedas and probably earlier to die psychologically to their body and exist in a new relationship to the natural world, to exist as free agents, you could say, detached from animal suffering, looking at the world through the eyes of God, this extraterrestrial witness consciousness. These extraordinary individuals have gained genuine insight into the metaphysical realms and what it means to be in the world but not of it. As teachers, they pointed the way for millions to seek liberation by disidentifying from the small self and recognizing the Christ or the God within. And this is all true. Unfortunately, it's also true that transcendental strain of spiritual vision has spawned a lot of hypocrisy and suffering and pushed a lot of people like Toilet Brush to strive for some impossible vision of saintliness. In this striving for saintliness, they sacrifice a lot of what makes them passionate and juicy and original and vibrant, the soulful aspect, you could say, of their overly spiritualized lives. Now, the contrast between soul and spirit is a useful way of taking our own spiritual temperature. If you've read Thomas More or James Hillman, the Jungian psychologists, they use this figure of soul versus spirit to indicate two different ways of approaching the enlightened life. These aren't black and white labels, of course. They're just metaphors for different orientations. When they refer to spirit, they're pointing in the direction of transcendence, the prototypical idea of a celestial God that's pure and invisible and sublime and out of reach. Spiritual types want to be free of all smallness, including the body. They want to rid themselves of earthliness and limitation and particularity and edge. For spiritual types, the ideal is always beyond somewhere, and usually up, elevated and beyond form. Soulful types, on the other hand, tend to adhere to a more feminine vision of God, which finds divinity here on earth, in the personal, the physical, the manifest world, the poignant, embodied dimension of life that's always rooted in history. Soulful seekers tend to be more forgiving and less absolute, whereas spiritual seekers lean toward mastery and purification. Both of these orientations have a lot to offer, of course, and an integrated life is one that includes both of them. Still, it's very important to remember that both soul and spirit cast different kinds of shadows when taken to extremity. Spiritual perfectionism leads to idealism, to judgment, to disembodiment. Perfectionism among more soul-oriented types can veer toward over-attachment to the form of things, to ancestral place, to earthboundness, and to the denial of what is transcended. The majority of us are aware of both of these impulses, but if you look closely, you'll notice that you tend more toward one than the other. And it's useful to know what type you are. Are you somebody who'd rather fly high or dig deep? Do you wish that you could be rid of your body, your earthly form, without actually having to die? Or do you relish in your sensual self and reject the notion of transcendence, of living as pure consciousness? Does the idea of that kind of liberation leave you feeling uninspired and chilly? Once you get a general idea of which camp you belong to, it'll help you understand your own brand of perfectionism. And in turn, this understanding helps to widen and deepen our sense of the world and what an awakened life might look like. As Meher Baba, the great Parsi master, put it, quote, "When mind soars in pursuit of the things conceived in space, it pursues emptiness. But when man dives deep within himself, he experiences the fullness of existence. Let me read that again. When mind soars in pursuit of the things conceived in space, it pursues emptiness. But when man dives deep within himself, he experiences the fullness of existence. In other words, both of these orientations offer different complementary versions of the truth, and both are necessary to a holistic appreciation of our lives. Both also remind us to be humble, because we cannot attain these ideals of perfection in any sort of permanent way. When we appreciate that this is exactly as it should be, humility helps to soften the ego's hard edges, and it puts us in a more true proportion to life. We no longer suffer from grandiose visions of mastery or self-completion. Instead, we recognize that we are forever beginning, and this freedom relieves the pressure to pretend to be wiser or better or more perfect than we already are. The willingness to accept our humanity leads to the kind of surrender that we've talked about a lot in the Seekers Forum, which isn't resignation or complacency, but rather the ability to surrender to God, to surrender to the Tao, the way of things, the flow of life that is infinitely stronger and wiser than we are. Without surrender, there is no freedom. So ask yourself, where do you need to surrender in your life? Where do you battle your own imperfections but never seem to win? How does pride interfere with your growth, emotionally as well as spiritually? And which images of your enlightened self, this imaginary enlightened self, block you from making peace with what is already here and now? These are powerful questions to ask on the Seeker's Path, and I recommend that you try exploring them in writing as a practice of self-inquiry. It's very, very helpful. Now, just a few red flags to watch out for when investigating perfectionism. First, does being human cause you shame? Do you hide your contradictions and your weaknesses? And if so, why? Number two, is it hard for you to forgive yourself? And what about other people? Perfectionism conspires against forgiveness. Number three, how often do you experience contempt? What about envy? What about dissatisfaction through comparison with your own lot? Number four, are you concerned with spiritual appearance? This is a very common phenomenon, with looking holy or looking pure to other people. Where do you try to be better seeming than you actually are? Next, do you long for a kind of superhuman goodness? Do you measure yourself against a sanitized standard of what a spiritual seeker is supposed to look like? Next, can you admit your flaws with humility? Is there a transparency between your private and your public self? Or are there pockets of hypocrisy or double standards that deserve exploration? Next, do you now or have you ever considered spirituality to be an escape from pain? This is a huge issue. When I first started to practice, I had imported the secret idea, the secret misconception, that if I practiced, it would help me avoid pain. That more enlightenment meant less pain, or more awareness or more awakeness meant less pain, when in fact the opposite is sometimes true. As we awaken, we often feel more pain. The difference is that we don't attach to it or identify it in the same way. But the idea that spiritual perfection means not hurting is a lie that needs to be dug out right away. It has nothing to do with the truth. And finally, do you use this commitment to awakening as a way to connect or to disconnect from ordinary life and to people who aren't on the path? These are very important questions to ask. If spirituality has caused any kind of snobbery in you toward people who are not leading what you deem to be examined lives, then you're using spirituality to feed your ego, to feed into a kind of perfectionism that has nothing to do with wisdom. and which is actually diminishing you as a compassionate human being and as a force of love in the world. A few years back, I was waiting online with 100 people or so at the grave of this long-dead saint in Pune in central India. And I had a big teaching about imperfection. In front of me online was a German woman who was helping her son, who had Down syndrome, to kneel at the side of this marble tomb that people came to pay their respects at. This little boy, who couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, was having a hard time bending his knees and placing his head against the tomb. When he finally managed to lower himself to the ground, he put his cheek on the stone for a long time and didn't move. His mother was getting self-conscious, and she tried to hurry him along, but the rest of us didn't care, because this little boy's attempts at worship, his determination to pay his respects to this great saint, seemed to elevate the rest of us, elevate the hearts of the rest of us pilgrims who were watching him. And afterward, in the hall where we all met and talked to one of the dead saint's closest disciples, I heard something that I've never forgotten. This helper, he had been his personal secretary for 50 years, this old guy wearing a Rice-A-Roni T-shirt that someone had brought him from San Francisco, he was talking about his master, this great man who had blessed hundreds and thousands of people who had come to him for his darshan or divine presence. And what Erich said was this. He said, Baba loved everyone. Most of all, though, he liked the scoundrels, the bad ones like me. When he said this, he smiled, he gave this sort of wicked smile, and it was easy to see him as this sort of bad boy aristocrat that he had actually been once upon a time before meeting his master. And Erich said then, the naughty ones is who Baba liked the best. Some people would come to him pretending to be holy. They would sit up very straight and tell him how good they were, how pure, how enlightened. But Baba would just smile and move them along. Then the secretary said this. He said, God does not need your holiness. And he kind of swatted the H word out of the air and laughed. He said, God does not need your goodness. And then someone in the crowd asked, what does he need then? And our host said, God wants your humanness, nothing more. God wants your humanness, nothing more. You know, Mother Mira says the same thing differently. She says, God created normal human beings, not imperfect ones. Can remember this on the path. Then the pressure to be other than who we are begins to ease. And we learn to be okay inside our fallible human forms. And to remember in those moments when we lose sight of the light or eternity or God or Buddha mind, that nothing has changed but our idea of reality. That nothing has changed but the ego losing sight of what is always here. That's very, very important. And when we remember that, perfectionism starts to fall away. We see that it's nothing but a figment of the imagination. And then, in fact, things as they are precisely as they're meant to be.